Welcome to this deep dive. We are going to be exploring how modern medicine has really kind of changed the way we age and die.
Hmm.
And the source material for this deep dive is Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal.
Oh, yeah.
And it really makes you question whether living longer automatically means living better,
Right.
especially as we approach the end of life.
That's a great way to put it. It
Yeah.
really is. Gawande starts by celebrating all the incredible strides that medicine has made,
Yeah.
increasing lifespans, curing diseases.
Hmm.
But then he asks this really thought-provoking question. He says, have we turned aging and dying into purely medical events? And in doing so, have we lost sight of what really matters?
It's almost like we've traded one problem for another, right?
Right.
So in the past, death would often come suddenly. It'd be
Yeah.
like falling through a trap door.
Yeah.
Gawande gives the example of his own grandmother, who died from malaria at a young age,
Right.
and his wife's father, who had a sudden heart attack at age 60. So those are classic examples of that trapdoor model.
That's right. Yeah.
But now things are different with medical advancements.
Yeah, so instead of a sudden drop, we often see this slow decline.
Right.
He calls it the slow fade.
Yeah.
And we can manage individual health issues as they pop up, but that can sometimes result in a much longer, more drawn-out process of dying.
It's so true.
Yeah, it's like even with terminal illnesses, treatments can make people feel relatively healthy
Yeah.
for a while, so when death does come,
Right.
it can still feel sudden, even if you've had a diagnosis for years.
It's such a strange paradox, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
We're dying later, but the process can feel more medicalized,
Yeah,
more managed.
right.
And I don't know, sometimes it feels like the focus is on simply extending life
Mhm.
rather than ensuring that those extra years are actually meaningful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, one of the key points he makes is that the medical system isn't necessarily equipped to deal with this new reality.
It's so true.
There's a shortage of geriatricians, doctors who specialize in elder care,
Right.
and, the focus in medical training is often on curing disease
Right.
rather than managing the complexities of aging.
It's a real disconnect, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
We're living longer, but the systems of care haven't necessarily caught up to that reality.
Right.
And what's even more thought-provoking, I think, is Gawande's exploration of how our well-intentioned efforts to protect older people can sometimes backfire.
Yeah.
He talks about his wife's Aunt Alice.
Yeah.
She was this fiercely independent woman who lived on her own,
Yeah.
took care of herself, mowed her own lawn.
That's right.
I mean, this lady was going for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Alice's story is so important because it highlights this tension between safety and autonomy.
Right.
She had a few falls, a car accident,
Oh.
even a scam that targeted her vulnerability.
Oh, wow.
And while those events were, concerning,
Right.
they also chipped away at her independence. When she eventually moved to an assisted living facility,
Yeah.
she was physically safer, but her spirit just declined.
It's like that really struck me in the book,
Yeah.
It made me question whether a life that's completely safe but devoid of purpose and independence
Right.
is actually a better life.
Mhm.
What's the point of safety if
Exactly.
you've lost the things that make life worth living?
Right.
And it reminded me of what Gawande wrote about the shift from poorhouses to pensions.
Yeah.
Like, it's great that we've moved away from warehousing the elderly in institutions,
Right.
but just giving people financial security
Yeah.
doesn't solve the problem of frailty and dependence.
It doesn't.
It doesn't address that human need for purpose and meaning.
That's such a critical point.
Yeah.
It makes us question the very models we use to understand aging.
Right.
He even brings up Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Right.
which, starts with basic survival needs at the bottom
Uh-huh.
and progresses to self-actualization at the top. But he challenges whether that model really reflects the priorities of aging.
Instead, he highlights the work of psychologist Laura Carstensen
Yes.
and her socio-emotional selectivity theory.
Yeah.
And this theory suggests that as we age and our time horizons shrink, our priorities change.
They do.
Achievement becomes less important,
Hmm.
and connection and meaning take center stage.
Right.
And, it's interesting. Carstensen had a near-death experience herself,
Really?
which really shifted her perspective.
I can imagine.
She realized that what truly mattered were the relationships in her life,
Yeah.
not climbing the career ladder, chasing external achievements.
Right.
And her research has shown that this shift in priorities isn't limited to the elderly.
That's right.
She did a study with men diagnosed with AIDS, and even though they were young,
Yeah.
their focus shifted towards relationships and
Yeah.
making the most of their remaining time.
Yeah. It challenges that notion that these are just old people issues.
Mm,
These are human issues that
yes.
become even more pronounced as we face our own mortality, regardless of age.
Regardless of age. It's a really good point.
And this realization has profound implications for how we care for the elderly.
Hmm.
If connection and meaning are so central to well-being in later life,
Right.
shouldn't those be central to how we design care systems and living environments?
It makes you wonder if we've got it all backwards, right?
Yeah, it does.
Focusing on safety and physical needs without considering the emotional and spiritual needs
Right.
that are so essential to human flourishing.
Absolutely. And that's where the work of Dr. Bill Thomas comes in.
Oh, right, yeah.
He was a doctor who completely revolutionized the nursing home model
Right?
with something called the Eden Alternative.
Okay, so this is where things get really interesting.
It does.
So Thomas took this sterile, hospital-like nursing home
Yeah.
and literally brought life into it.
He did.
Plants, pets, even children
Oh, wow.
became part of the daily routine.
That's amazing.
It was all about creating a sense of purpose for the residents,
Right.
recognizing that they needed more than just basic care.
Yeah.
They needed to feel connected to life, to have reason to get out of bed in the morning.
Right.
And the results were pretty remarkable.
Wait.
One study at Chase Memorial Nursing Home
Okay.
showed that residents in the Eden Alternative Program actually had lower death rates
Wow.
and needed less medication.
Isn't that incredible?
It is incredible.
The implication is that when we address these deeper human needs for connection and purpose, people actually thrive, even in the face of illness and aging.
It really challenges our assumptions about what constitutes good care.
It does.
And this leads us to Lou Sanders, who had a very different experience with assisted living.
Oh.
So he had a heart attack, then he developed Parkinson's disease,
Oh, wow.
and needed more help than his daughter Shelley could provide at home.
So assisted living seemed like the, obvious next step.
Yeah, the obvious next step, right? But Lou's first experience with assisted living was a far cry from what he or Shelley had hoped for.
Yeah.
He felt infantilized, controlled, and stripped of his autonomy.
I bet.
I was safe, but miserable.
Yeah. And Lou's experience highlights the gap between the original vision for assisted living
Right.
and how it often plays out in reality.
Right.
Karen Wilson, one of the pioneers of the assisted living movement, believed that frail elderly people should still have control over their lives.
Right.
She envisioned assisted living as a true alternative to nursing homes,
Yeah.
a place where people could retain their independence and dignity.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds great.
It does.
But the reality is that many assisted living facilities prioritize the desires of the children over the needs of the residents. They focus on appearances, on safety metrics, on what looks good on paper, rather than what truly matters to the people living there.
It raises the question, how do we measure success in assisted living?
That's a good question.
If it's just about preventing falls and ensuring medication compliance,
Yeah.
are we missing the point?
Right.
Are we ignoring the deeper human needs for autonomy, purpose, and connection?
And that brings us back to Lou Sanders.
Yeah.
He eventually found his way to the Leonard Florence Center for Living,
Okay.
a place built on the principles of the greenhouse model, which prioritizes resident autonomy and choice.
So interesting.
But before we dive into that, let's talk about this fascinating concept that Gawande brings up.
Okay.
It's called autonomy as narrative.
Oh, yeah. Autonomy as narrative.
Yeah.
This is such a powerful idea.
It is.
It suggests that even with physical limitations, we still crave the freedom to shape our own life stories.
Yeah.
It's about having choices, making decisions, and feeling like the author of our own lives, even as our bodies decline.
It reminds me of the philosopher Josiah Royce and his philosophy of loyalty.
Oh, yeah.
Royce argued that we find meaning by attaching ourselves to something larger than ourselves, whether it's a cause, a community, or a family. And this gives our lives purpose, even in the face of death.
I think that's where autonomy as narrative comes in.
Right.
It's about having the freedom to choose what we're loyal to,
Yeah.
what gives our lives meaning, even within the constraints of aging and illness.
And Gawande illustrates this beautifully with the story of Peg, the music teacher who was dying of cancer.
Oh, I remember Peg.
Even as her body was failing her,
Yeah.
she found immense meaning in continuing to teach her student, Hunter, until the very end.
Wow. Peg's story is such a powerful reminder that even in the face of death, purpose and connection can bring profound joy and fulfillment.
Yeah.
It's not just about extending life, it's about living it fully, right up until the very last moment.
It really makes you question whether our current systems of care are doing enough to support that kind of flourishing at the end of life.
That is the question.
Are we creating spaces where people like Peg can continue to find meaning and purpose even as their bodies decline?
That's the challenge, isn't it? To move beyond a purely medical model of care and embrace a more holistic approach that honors the whole person,
Right.
including their emotional, spiritual, and social needs.
And that's exactly what Lou Sanders found at the Leonard Florence Center.
Okay.
It wasn't just about keeping him safe. It was about giving him the freedom to shape his days, to connect with others, to be the author of his own story, even as his body declined.
Wonderful.
But let's save that story for part 2 of our deep dive.
Okay.
I think that's a good place to stop for now.
Sounds good.
So we left off talking about Lou Sanders and his experience finding, like, true autonomy at the Leonard Florence Center.
Right.
It just seems like such a different approach to assisted living.
Yeah.
One that actually honors the needs and desires of the residents.
It is.
But, being mortal isn't just about creating these, supportive spaces.
Right.
It's also about having the courage to have difficult conversations.
Yeah.
Kind of conversations most of us would rather avoid, right?
That's so true.
Like nobody wants to talk about death.
No, it's tough.
But Gawande, he doesn't shy away from the messy reality of end-of-life conversations, all the anxiety and fear that comes up,
Right.
not just for the patient, but for their loved ones, even for their doctors.
Yeah, it's a lot.
And, he talks about this pressure to do more.
Yeah.
Keep fighting, even when the odds are stacked against you.
It's like this cultural imperative to fight death at all costs.
Yeah, and he shares this incredibly poignant story about Sarah Monopoly.
Oh, yeah, I remember Sarah.
This young mother who was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer shortly after giving birth.
Oh, that's right.
Talk about a heart-wrenching situation.
It really is. It's such a difficult situation.
Trying to make treatment decisions when you have a newborn baby and the clock is ticking.
Right.
It just highlights how complex these situations can be.
It really does.
Sarah's story really underscores the need for open and honest communication between doctors, patients, and families.
Right.
And, Gawande makes the point that it's not enough for doctors to just present a list of treatment options.
Right.
Like, they need to really understand the patient's goals and priorities, what they value most in their remaining time,
Right.
and then tailor the care to meet those needs.
It's really about shifting from a purely medical model to a more person-centered approach.
Right. And this is where palliative care comes in.
Yes.
For a long time, I thought palliative care was only for people in, like, the final stages of life.
Yeah, a lot of people think that.
But Gawande explains that it's actually about improving the quality of life for anyone with a serious illness at any stage.
That's a really important point.
Yeah, like at any stage.
It really is.
And it's not just about making people comfortable.
No.
Research actually shows that palliative care can actually help people live longer in some cases.
Oh, wow.
Because it addresses the whole person, not just the disease.
It's a more holistic approach.
And he talks about this amazing example in La Crosse, Wisconsin.
Oh, yes, La Crosse, where they've created a culture of, like, proactive end-of-life conversations.
Yeah.
It's not seen as, like, taboo or morbid.
Right.
It's just a normal part of healthcare.
Yeah, they've normalized it.
And the results are pretty incredible.
Really?
So not only are people in La Crosse receiving care that's more aligned with their wishes,
Right.
but they're also spending less time in hospitals
That's great.
and incurring lower healthcare costs.
Oh, that's interesting.
I find that so hopeful,
Yeah, it's very hopeful.
It shows that we can change the way we approach death and dying.
Right.
It doesn't have to be this scary, mysterious thing that we avoid talking about.
It doesn't.
We can have these conversations, plan for the future, and make choices that reflect our values.
That's key.
And, part of changing that conversation involves understanding how we experience suffering.
Yeah.
Not just physically, but also emotionally and psychologically.
That's right.
Gawande brings up Daniel Kahneman's research.
On the experiencing self versus the remembering self.
Yeah, but to self.
Which has profound implications for how we think about end-of-life care.
Yeah, that's fascinating research.
Oh, that's the research where Kahneman found that we tend to remember the peak moments and the ending of an experience most vividly, even if the overall experience involved a lot of suffering, right?
That's right.
I remember reading about that.
It's fascinating stuff.
It's fascinating.
What it means is that two patients could have a similar level of pain over a period of time.
Yeah.
But if one patient has, like, a brief period of relief at the end,
Right.
their memory of the experience will be more positive
Yeah.
than the patient whose pain continued until the very last moment.
So it's not just about minimizing pain.
Yeah.
It's also about creating positive experiences.
Yeah.
Especially towards the end.
Yeah.
It's about understanding that how we remember an experience, especially a difficult one,
Right.
is shaped not just by the total amount of suffering, but also by the intensity of the peak moments and how it all ends.
Exactly. And this has huge implications for how we approach end-of-life care.
It does.
It suggests that we need to be paying attention not just to the physical aspects of suffering,
Right.
but also to the emotional and psychological aspect.
Right.
We need to create opportunities for connection, joy, and meaning, even in the midst of decline.
And this brings us to Gawande's own personal story.
Okay, yeah.
Which is, woven throughout the book.
Yeah.
He shares his experience with his father's decline and how they navigated the difficult choices that came along with it.
Yeah.
It's a very personal and moving account of facing mortality within a family.
Yeah, it's incredibly powerful.
It's very powerful.
His father was a surgeon,
Right.
a man who had dedicated his life to saving lives.
Yeah.
And yet, he had to come to terms with his own mortality,
Right.
which wasn't easy.
No, not at all.
And he made the difficult decision to forego aggressive treatment for a spinal cord tumor.
Yeah. He chose to focus on quality of life
Right.
in his remaining time.
And what's so inspiring is that even though he was facing eternal illness, Gawande's father found new meaning and purpose in his life.
I thought that was so interesting.
He did, yeah.
He retired from surgery, but he became deeply involved in his community.
That's amazing.
Connecting with people in new ways.
That's a powerful reminder that a good ending isn't about avoiding death.
Right.
It's about living in a way that's true to your values.
Yeah.
Right up until the very end.
Up until the very end.
And it's not just about the person who is dying,
Yeah.
It's about the people around them.
Right.
The family and friends who are sharing that journey.
And Gawande talks about the incredible support his father received from his hospice nurse, who wasn't just focused on managing his physical symptoms, but also on helping him find peace and meaning in his final days.
It's beautiful.
It really highlights the vital role that compassionate caregivers play in helping people navigate the end of life.
It's such important work.
It is. And then there's this beautiful story of his father's death and the scattering of his ashes in the Ganges River, a ritual that was deeply meaningful to their family's Hindu faith.
Right.
Even in that moment of profound loss, there's this sense of beauty and dignity.
I agree.
A recognition that this life, however finite, has come to a peaceful close.
Yeah, Gawande also acknowledges the tension between his own beliefs as a doctor, trained in Western medicine, and the cultural traditions surrounding death in his family's culture.
It's a reminder that there are many ways to approach death and dying.
Absolutely.
And what matters most is finding an approach that feels authentic and meaningful to the individual and their loved ones.
And it's about respecting individual choices, honoring cultural beliefs, and recognizing the power of ritual, and helping us cope with loss and find solace in the face of the unknown.
And ultimately, being mortal is about more than just death and dying, isn't it?
It is.
It's about living a life filled with meaning and purpose.
Right.
Knowing that our time is finite and choosing to make the most of it.
It's about recognizing that aging and dying are not medical failures, but natural parts of the human experience.
And it's about having the courage to have difficult conversations, to make choices that reflect our values, and to create a world where we can all live fully and die with dignity.
Such a powerful message.
I think it's one that's deeply relevant to all of us.
It is.
But let's dive into that a bit more in part 3 of our deep dive. As we've been talking about all of this, one thing that really strikes me is how much our society seems to struggle with the very idea of aging and dying.
It's true.
It's like we're so focused on youth and vitality that we've lost sight of the beauty and the wisdom that come with getting older.
Yeah, there's this real sense of denial around mortality in modern culture.
Yeah.
We're bombarded with messages about staying young, anti-aging products, and this idea that we can somehow cheat death.
Right.
Which makes it really hard to face the reality that we're all getting older, and eventually our bodies will wear out.
It's like we're afraid to even talk about it.
Right.
Which makes it even harder to prepare for it, you know?
Exactly.
Both for ourselves and for our loved ones.
And that fear, that denial, it can lead to all sorts of problems.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, it can make us avoid important conversations about our wishes for end-of-life care.
Right.
It can lead us to make decisions based on fear rather than on what's truly important to us.
That makes sense.
And it can create a system of care that's focused on prolonging life at all costs, even when it means sacrificing quality of life.
So, taking all of this into consideration, what would you say are the key takeaways from being mortal?
Okay, well, for me, one of the most important takeaways is that we need to shift our focus.
Okay.
From simply extending life to living it well. Right to the very end.
Living well.
That means having honest conversations with ourselves and our loved ones about what matters most to us.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, what are our values? What brings us joy? What legacy do we want to leave behind?
It's about defining what a good ending looks like.
Yes.
On our own terms, right?
Absolutely.
Not letting fear or societal expectations dictate our choices.
Exactly.
And it means making informed choices about our care, right?
It does.
Like understanding the options that are available to us and advocating for ourselves.
Yes. Being active participants in our own healthcare journey, even as our bodies become more fragile.
And it's also about creating a different kind of culture around aging and dying, isn't it?
Absolutely.
A culture that embraces the wisdom and experience of our elders. That sees aging as a natural and meaningful part of life, not something to be feared or hidden away.
It's about recognizing that older people have so much to offer.
Right.
Even as their physical abilities decline, their stories, their perspectives, their resilience. These are all valuable treasures that can enrich our lives and our communities.
It's a real call to action.
It is.
Both on an individual level and on a societal level. It's about challenging our assumptions. Having those difficult conversations. And advocating for a system of care that prioritizes not just extending life, but living it well, right to the very last breath.
Being Mortal is a book that stays with you long after you finish reading it.
It
raises these profound questions.
It
challenges our deeply held beliefs.
And
ultimately, it offers a more humane and compassionate way of thinking about how we live and how we die.
And I think it's a book that everyone should read, regardless of age or health status. It's not just about preparing for death.
Right.
It's about living a more meaningful and fulfilling life, knowing that our time is precious and finite.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a question I want you to ponder. What does a good ending look like to you? What steps can you take today to ensure that your story and the stories of those you love are written with dignity, purpose, and love?
That's a powerful question.
It is.
And one that I hope will stay with you long after this deep dive is over.
I hope so, too.
Thanks for joining us on this exploration of being mortal.
It's been a pleasure.
A book that invites us to think deeply about what it means to live a good life and to die a good death.